Hello, my name's Kent Hovind. Good afternoon, Kent Hovind here. Hello, folks, Kent Hovind here.
Good evening, folks. Kent Hovind here and the crew at Dinosaur Adventure Land. Good evening, folks. Kent Hovind here and the crew at Dinosaur Adventure Land in Lenox, Alabama. Good evening, folks. Kent Hovind here and the crew at Dinosaur Adventure Land in lovely Lenox, Alabama. Hovind here and the crew at Dinosaur Adventure Land in lovely Lenox, Alabama. We're the folks who believe the Bible is literally true and scientifically accurate. God made everything in 6 days, like he said. Dinosaurs lived with man. They did not live millions of years ago. There is no geologic column. There is no fossil record. You've been lied to. We're here to help straighten that out. We think evolution is the dumbest and most dangerous religion in the history of the world. It's a mental illness. When a grown man dreams, he's related to a worm, a fern, and a frog, which all came from a dot, which came from a dot of nothing exploding. It's time to get him some serious help. Fast. Some of them are educated way beyond their intelligence, and they don't catch on. I've been taught something that's stupid.
Kent Hovind is an interesting guy. I mean, you've got a guy who grew up in a small town in Illinois, and over time was one of the most sought-after creationist speakers in America. The problem is that he's interesting in the wrong kind of way. Charles Manson is interesting, but there's no sane person who views him in a positive light. The details of the Chernobyl disaster are interesting, but it's not something anyone would have ever wanted to have experienced for themselves. Kent Hovind falls into a similar category, and how he got there was entirely of his own accord. There's no one that Kent can factually point to and say, all of these things happened in my life because of this person or that person. Where Kent is today is because of Kent. If you've never heard of Kent Hovind, you wouldn't be to blame. He's a figure who has largely been ostracized from any community he has ever come into contact with, including his own family. So much so that he now resides in a place called Lenox, Alabama, surviving off the goodwill of others. Kent Hovind is a creationist Christian who suggests that the theory of evolution is a lie and that the Bible is literally true, and
the evolution theory is the dumbest and most dangerous religion in the history of the planet.
There's been plenty who have voiced their opinions about him. Some think he is a godly man serving the Lord proudly. Some view him as an uneducated preacher, loudly arguing against a subject he drastically misunderstands. Others view him as a con man and a highly abusive individual, both mentally and physically.
This is my house!
Damn phone!
The following documentary is in no way an argument against evolution or against creationism at all. The single, sole reason behind this series is to disclose the story behind Kent Hovind and those who have been hurt by him. Nothing more. The story deserves to be told in a manner befitting its circumstances. His victims deserve it to be told in a manner that recognizes the pain he put them through. This is their story, just as much as it's Kent's. Kent was raised in East Peoria, Illinois, a modestly sized town in the 1960s and 70s. Over time, I have attempted to reach out to those who knew Kent, whether it be individuals he has mentioned, schools he has attended, or churches he was attached to. None have opted to comment. Details of his early life tend to begin at East Peoria High School, where Kent graduated from in 1971. In 1969, he claims to have given his heart to the Lord, becoming a born-again Christian. After his conversion to Christianity, Kent began attending Bethel Baptist Church in Pekin, Illinois, a short 8-mile drive from East Peoria. Once Kent graduated high school, he attended Illinois Central College, which would be the only accredited higher education that Kent would receive. During this time, he would work for Bethel Baptist Church until he later transferred to Midwestern Baptist College in 1972, at the time located in Pontiac, Michigan, where Kent remained until 1974. The following years set up a fundamental foundation for his future and are worth exploring. Midwestern was a completely unaccredited university founded by Pastor Tom Malone, a once famous preacher who passed away on January 7, 2007. Tom Malone was a major figure of the Independent Fundamentality Baptist movement, a small, insignificant, but loud sect of Christianity that fiercely opposes modernism and liberalism. Malone's purpose behind the formation of Midwestern Baptist College in 1953 was more about character building rather than education. To get a clearer picture of Midwestern Baptist College in the 1970s and for Pastor Tom Malone as well, I sat down with Bruce Gurenser, a Midwestern Baptist College alum from 1976 to 1979 who has since left the church and his faith altogether. In the interview, Bruce explained that the students of the college were mandated to attend Pastor Malone's church, which was highly conservative in nature, and pressed upon its students that a secular education was not advised. Bruce explained that he agreed with the sentiment that independent fundamentalist Baptist churches seem to either produce or attract individuals of a narcissistic disposition, and mentions that the college had misogynistic mentalities towards women. Over the years, Bruce would drift from these beliefs, though maintaining his marriage still to this day with his wife Polly, who he met at Midwestern.
It just became quite oppressive. Here we are in 2022, and those churches are still churning out that same kind of thinking. Their colleges are still churning out preachers who preach those things, and it's harmful. I'm sure I will be called a failure, on that regard, and I will admit that I was. But I tried, and so yeah.
From the research that I've gathered, I believe it was Kent's years at Midwestern, under the influence of Tom Malone, that shaped Kent into who he is today. They both believe that the King James Version of the Bible is the only one worth reading. They both, like the Bible, think homosexuality is an abomination.
Homosexuality is wrong, it's evil, it's wicked, I think it's stupid.
They both, like the Bible, think men are the head of the house.
I think sometimes people are afraid to speak about the husband being the head of the home. But we shouldn't fear what the Bible teaches. God made it that way. Well, I've heard women say, well, he's the head, but I'm the neck. I'll turn him any way I want to. No, you won't. Not if he's a real man.
What did she call her husband? My Lord. Now, because of this one statement right here, she ended up listed in the New Testament as the perfect wife. Likewise, ye wives, be in subjection to your own husbands. You just have to submit.
They both think the Bible is literally true, believe the world to be 6,000 or so years old, and advocate for baptism by immersion in water. But there is one key element to Kent's time at Midwestern, and it comes from Tom Malone. In a 1971 sermon titled, "Can America Survive This?", Malone had a few statements against evolution. In part 3 of the sermon, Malone explains, "Evolution has been taught in the schools of this country for the last 60 years, from the wee grades of elementary school right on through college. You cannot be an evolutionist and a believer in the Word of God at the same time. Evolution is not just a theory. It is a wicked attack against the Bible." A young Kent Hovind, sitting in the congregation, absorbing these ideas like a sponge. It doesn't seem to be a stretch to assume that Kent is simply an imitator, lacking the intelligence to form conclusions of his own, or the ability to take what he has learned and form new conclusions based upon his education that his educators may not have. Kent's disgust for atheists and views against evolution are not original. He's just a copy of Tom Malone. Yet, Kent failed in one area of following in Tom Malone's footsteps. He was ordained on May 25, 1974 at Emmanuel Baptist Church. Kent returned to Pekin, Illinois, back to Bethel Baptist Church, where he eventually became pastor in 1976 after the previous pastor resigned for reasons unknown to me. Kent lasted just 2 years as pastor before resigning in 1978 and moved his family to Bourbonnais, Illinois, where he would teach at Faith Baptist Church. Currently, the church boasts their Faith Baptist Academy, but indicates that this academy did not begin until 1995. I'm sure he did teach in some capacity at this church, but whatever records of their students, faculty, or records of any kind do not seem to have been transferred into any digital format to be researched. The pastor at Faith Baptist Church, Bob Gray Sr., left the church for Longview Baptist Temple in Longview, Texas. Bob Gray Sr., who has refused to comment in any capacity in regards to Kent Hovind, invited Kent in 1981 to join him in Longview, Texas. Kent agreed and moved his family there, where he claims to have taught math and science at the Longview Christian Academy. He remained there until 1986, where he then went to become assistant pastor and principal at Calvary Baptist Christian School until 1989, when he moved the family to Pensacola, Florida. That decision marked the beginning of Kent's second phase of his evangelist life, and the decisions that would destroy his future. While his wife, Jo, finished her degree in music, Kent began studying for his master's and doctorate degree from 1988 until 1991 from Patriot Bible University. This study was done via correspondence, and while that process is a legitimate means for receiving higher education, Patriot Bible University is an unaccredited university and is categorized as a diploma mill. A diploma mill is defined as a company or organization that has a low bar of requirements for study and a high bar for payment of said diploma. I have made multiple efforts to talk to the staff at Patriot Bible University, but nearly all have refused, all with the exception of a woman named Tony. I asked about the courses that Patriot Bible University offers and details of what my study would look like should I wish to enroll with their university, to which her answers mimicked that of the description on Creation Wiki. No professors. The students are expected to study and learn on their own. The materials that Patriot Bible provided on creationism were predominantly from the works of Dr. Henry Morris, who, unlike Kent, has a legitimate doctorate, but it's a doctorate in engineering. Henry Morris has no degrees of any kind in evolutionary biology, geology, paleontology, or anything outside of simple engineering and hydraulic engineering. Despite Henry Morris having no higher education in these studies, it should come as no surprise that Kent Hovind, like with Tom Malone, produces no originality to the topic of evolution and instead regurgitates the arguments produced from someone who had no education in the topics he discussed.
There is no evidence at all for evolution in the fossil record.
This textbook says the fossil record provides some of the strongest evidence that species evolved over time. This is just plain silly.
You've got to have buried animals and plants. They've got to be buried by sediments, and furthermore, buried quickly.
See, fossils don't form unless they're buried quickly.
So you date the fossil by the rocks and the rocks by the fossils. Both are based on evolution. And you begin to see, I hope, that we're involved in a vast circle of reasoning here.
If the layers are dated by the fossils and the fossils are dated by the layers, that is absolute stupidity.
It would take a long time to form that canyon by the river gradually eroding it down at the bottom. And as a matter of fact, it would take a long time for all the sediments with their layers there to be deposited too. You'd think, but no, as a matter of fact, all of those sedimentary layers, fine stratified sediments, were formed in essentially one day, and the canyon was eroded in essentially one day.
One of the biggest lies they teach the kids in school is that it took millions of years to make Grand Canyon. Grand Canyon formed in less than a week.
And other versions might say sea monsters or something else, but the word in the Hebrew is tanin, which is in other parts of the Old Testament translated dragons. God created the great dragons of the world. What's that? That's a dinosaur. That's what they used to be called.
You say, Brother Hovind, is this a fire-breathing dragon? Yep, sure is. The Bible talks about fire-breathing dragons.
They died out fairly recently, and maybe they haven't died out completely. We still get reports every once in a while.
And there might be a few still alive.
The vast majority of his higher education is worthless, and his arguments are from someone who merely studied engineering. Kent Hovind is not educated. He is simply good at memorizing arguments and regurgitating them. which provides the explanation behind why Kent repeats the same responses he gives to questions in regards to evolution, regardless of how different the questions may be. Because all he knows is what Henry Morris and Tom Malone told him. This is something that R.N. Raw noted in his review of Kent Hovind's series Lies in the Textbooks, saying,
"It's not just that the preacher doesn't have an accredited degree and obviously never studied any of the things he speaks about so authoritatively. It's worse than that. He apparently doesn't know what any of the words he uses actually mean, according to the scientists who define them. That's why his criticisms don't make sense. He shows no hint that he even knows what he's saying."
It's one thing for your lessons to be inspired by the people who taught you. In fact, that's inevitable. But it's another to just repeat it. That's not education. If I were to simply read to you the words from an expert on how a nuclear power plant works, the information I regurgitate could be correct, but that doesn't make me an expert on nuclear power plants, because I have no training or education in that field. I myself would not be the reliable source. Now, it's important to point out that Kent's behavior as a parrot doesn't by default mean he is wrong. I, of course, believe he is, but the point I am specifically making here, as I mentioned at the beginning of the documentary, isn't to argue against his creationist claims. The point is to review Kent Hovind and the fact that he is not a reliable source of information on the topic of evolution, because all he does is regurgitate the works of another person, and said person was only educated in engineering. Everything that is Kent Hovind is bootleg plagiarism. The title of the documentary is The Weakness of Kent Hovind, and one of Kent's weaknesses is simply that Kent is an unextraordinary person. More correctly, his weakness isn't just that he is unextraordinary, but that he has a problem with that. It's not enough that he is just a person like everyone else. He desires to be above others. Pastor Tom Malone and Henry Morris are men that I feel confident enough to assume that Kent viewed as extraordinary. He witnessed people respecting them. He witnessed people listening to them, seeking their advice. He wanted to be them. He wanted authority.
Every military of every country in the world knows you have to have a chain of command, and you have to obey the officer over you. What first thing God said to Adam and Eve when they sinned in the garden in Genesis chapter 3, he said, "Adam, you got to work for a living now, bud. Eve, he's the boss."
Kent is just a cheap imitation of them, and deep down, I believe he knows it. He knows he is unextraordinary. He knows that he's just a parrot, and he knows he would be nothing without imitating them. The sad part is that may not have been true. Had Kent simply developed himself as an individual, seeking only to be himself, perhaps his future would not have been so bleak.
Well, this is it, son. This is it. 9 years in the making. You got a lot of people out there that have been praying for you. Thousands and thousands of testimonies coming in. People that have seen your tapes. And you're ready to get back out there, I know.
We are headed home now. We're in Mississippi. This Saturday, July 11th, will be the 9th anniversary of when the indictment was issued against me. It's been a long, interesting...
And you guys are all invited to the party this Saturday at 29 Cummings Road. So
my BOP, they give you this for free to go home.
you gotta be, I think they spent a good $3 on that.
And these Chinese tennis shoes, yeah, they're good, $1.50. So I'm all set.
Well, we got some different clothes for you in the car.
Oh, you do?
We got some new clothes for you.
Oh man.
Oh, man. Well, thank you guys for all your prayers. Anything else you want to say to them?
Well, it has been an amazing journey. God has been really good. I can see why so much of the Bible is written from prison. It just gives you a totally new perspective on 1,000 things, you know. And it's coming to the world. It's happening now in many countries, and it's Christians in America are so not ready for what's about to hit.
Kent Hovind may have been influenced heavily by Pastor Tom Malone and Henry Morris, but it's tough to say where Malone and Morris end and where Kent begins. I suppose if we were to look into any specific area behind Kent to find any originality, it would be his entanglements with the law. While I want to address Kent's various criminal activities throughout his life, here I want to address a specific time in Kent's life, his battle with the IRS. On March 1st, 1996, Hovind filed a Chapter 13 bankruptcy petition to avoid paying federal income taxes, claiming he was not a citizen of the United States and that he did not earn income, had no expenses, and no property. He claimed that as a minister, everything he owned belonged to God and he was not subject to paying taxes for doing God's work. On June 5, 1996, the court dismissed Hovind's bankruptcy case, finding he had lied about his possessions and income. The court upheld the IRS's determination that his claim was filed in bad faith for the sole purpose of avoiding payment of federal income taxes, and called Hovind's arguments patently absurd. It also said that the IRS had no record of the debtor ever having filed an income tax return. You need to remember that. In 2001, Hovind would create Dinosaur Adventure Land, which is likely what Kent would regard as his magnum opus in terms of the things that he has created. It was based in Pensacola, Florida, with the tagline reading, "Where dinosaurs and the Bible meet." In September of 2002, merely 1 year into Dinosaur Adventure Land's creation, Hovind was charged with failure to observe county zoning regulations for Dinosaur Adventure Land, which was a misdemeanor. However, this was not Kent's only issue with the local law, because in April of 2006, the Dinosaur Adventure Land buildings were closed by county officials, and the Florida Circuit Court found the owners in contempt, ordering fines of $500 for each day the buildings were used. Hovind argued that he did not need a permit due to the nature of the building, calling it a church and a part of his ministry. Yet, Hovind's organization had neither business licenses nor tax-exempt status, nor was it considered a church by the people who worked there. After a 5-year court battle over the $50 building permit, on June 5, 2006, Hovind pled nolo contendere as charged to 3 counts. Constructing a building without a permit, refusing to sign a citation, and violating the county building code. Hovind paid fines totaling $675. If these few petty legal infractions were all that had occurred, Kent's overinflated ego could potentially be ignored as little more than an annoying character flaw. Unfortunately, these property matters would soon be the least of Kent's concerns. Unbeknownst to Kent, in the mid-90s, Senior Vice President Rebecca Horton of the Pensacola Christian College, who had a conversation with Kent Hovind, reported Kent to the IRS for his comments against taxes. An individual who is closer to Kent than most also had something to note about Kent Hovind's tax views that further establishes Kent's long-standing conflict with the IRS. That person was Chad Hovind, Kent's nephew. Chad explains, "I have rarely spoken to my Uncle Kent over the years, and the few times we talked were at family gatherings or vacations where he was trying to convince family members that Social Security was optional, paying income tax was unconstitutional, and his 20-year battle with the IRS was going well. In our few talks, I told him that he was wrong on his views on taxes and was not respecting the rule of law. I told him his conspiracy talks of black helicopters and government conspiracies were not helping his credibility." As discussed, Kent Hovind is merely an imitator, being skilled in stealing the thoughts of others but producing very little of his own.
Nothing's original with me.
Though I am unsure of exactly where Kent adopted his views against taxation, I can at the very least point to one man who made a significant influence on him, if not ingrained the ideas into Kent: Glenn Stoll. Glenn Stoll founded Remedies at Law, serving as the director and general counsel to provide legal advice to people like Kent Hovind. As it would turn out, Glenn Stoll has no legal credentials whatsoever and is not a member of or licensed with any state or federal bar. Glenn Stoll helps churches, both legitimate and illegitimate, to become a corporation sole, which is usually a church that has one single officer and can be used to allow a church to hold title to property. But in these cases, the corporation sole is essentially designed to hide income and or assets and designed to evade income taxes. Glenn teaches that as a corporation sole, they don't have to file or pay taxes, citing a mandatory exemption to the IRC 508C1A for churches, even going so far as to claim that they are not even required to notify the IRS of their existence, nor are they authorized to collect or pay taxes to the government. However, like real churches, Glenn Stoll advises his customers that all donations to their church is tax deductible. Next, Glenn Stoll helps people set up ministerial trusts in conjunction with their corporation's soul. Because the two are connected, Glenn Stoll teaches his clients that they are now exempt from IRS laws, helping them to stop paying income and employment taxes. Each different missionary activity needs to have a separate ministerial trust set up, for which Glenn Stoll charges $4,000 to $4,500 for the first trust and $2,000 for each subsequent trust, and each of which is to be managed by the corporation's soul. Customers of these former businesses, which are now called churches, are asked to make checks out to the ministerial trust rather than to the individual so they don't have to report it as income. Part of this scheme involves concealing property, income, and profits. By placing both business and personal property in the name of the ministerial trust rather than the individual's name, Glenn Stoll tells his clients that the IRS cannot touch their assets. Unfortunately, that is simply not true, as Kent Hovind has since found out but still refuses to acknowledge. Glenn encourages people to transfer all of their assets, including personal property and furniture and cash, into these ministerial accounts, thereby allowing them to claim that they themselves own nothing, but that they live in a parsonage, their former personal home, and use the church's furniture, their former personal furniture, and equipment and vehicles, their former personal vehicles. Another aspect of Glenn Stoll's scheme is to call all employees independent contractors and telling clients that they now no longer have to file W-2s or 1099s. Lastly, Glenn Stoll requires that his customers contact him if they need to make a withdrawal of $10,000 or more in cash, which sets up a major domino effect in Kent's future. It should come as no surprise to find out that recently, in 2021, Glenn pled guilty to conspiracy to defraud the United States and evading the payment of federal income taxes. In 2003, during a phone interview with the New York Times, Kent Hovind openly stated, "I haven't filed a tax return in 30 years, which parallels the IRS's findings in their investigation into Kent Hovind's bankruptcy filing that I previously mentioned. With Kent's admission to avoiding filing taxes, the IRS's investigation into his bankruptcy case, his nephew explaining Kent's views against taxation, and after being reported to the IRS by Rebecca Horton, what came next should be no surprise. On July 11, 2006, Hovind was indicted on 58 counts in the district court in northern Florida in Pensacola. The first 12 counts were charges for willful failure to collect, account for, and pay over federal income taxes and FICA taxes in connection with the CSC operation, totaling $473,818 for the 12 fiscal quarters of 2001 to 2003. The next 45 counts were charges for knowingly structuring transactions by making multiple cash withdrawals, totaling $430,500, in amounts just under $10,000, which requires reporting, a technique known as structuring, which his wife was also charged. The last count was a charge of corruptly endeavoring to obstruct and impede the administration of the Internal Revenue laws by falsely listing the IRS as his only creditor when filing for bankruptcy, including filing a false and frivolous lawsuit against the IRS in which he demanded damages for criminal trespass, and was also charged for making threats of harm to those investigating him and to those who might consider cooperating with the investigation, as well as destroying records. Kent has made the claim multiple times that a SWAT team burst into his home to arrest him.
I was sitting in my office in Pensacola, in my house, getting ready for Bible study with the staff that morning. And the police officers and SWAT team came in. I said, "What's the matter?" They said, "You're under arrest." I said, "For what?" "For structuring."
But no record of a SWAT team or a team of similar nature has ever been found. From the testimony of IRS Special Agent Scott Schneider, a search warrant was granted to search the premises of Kent Hovind's home, where Kent was present. He and the other agents did not burst into the home and actually granted Kent Hovind quite a bit of freedom to roam about the house with them, which Agent Snyder explains the reason. "We allowed him a little bit more freedom in the spirit of cooperation. We allowed him, as we made our first contact and entry into the residence where we suspected guns to be present, to walk back with us and attempt to call out the individuals that were still inside. That's not something I would have normally done, but in this case, we erred on the side of trying to minimize the accusations that could be leveled at a later date." He further explains that the individuals who were present on the premises were identified, questioned, and whether or not they agreed to answer, they were free to go while they executed the search warrant. Not even Kent's lawyer attempts to even hint at excessive force being used because no such SWAT team was ever involved. Although lying is not beyond Kent Hovind, as Agent Snyder soon found out. The agents executing the search warrant were not without their suspicions of Kent Hovind's potential for violence. Hovind made a series of veiled threats against the IRS agents, being quoted by saying the following: "God knows how to deal with people who challenge his ministry." During a radio broadcast while discussing the case, Kent made reference to Psalm 55:15 in regards to the IRS. Psalm 55:15 reads, "Let death seize upon them, and let them go down quickly into hell, for wickedness is in their dwellings and among them. Let death seize upon them." But it was not words alone that made the IRS agents cautious when dealing with Kent Hovind. They had been informed of a rumor that Kent was armed, but when asked about weapons on the property, Kent lied about the locations of the guns throughout the house. In the search, they found a Tech-9 pistol and SKS rifle, and numerous other pistols, some of which were loaded. Despite being afforded the freedom to roam about within reason, Kent immediately abused this freedom by instructing one of his workers, Dan Wood, to not comply with the orders given by the IRS agent, which led to Dan Wood physically pushing past an agent and refusing to leave the premises, leading to his detainment. There was no SWAT team, and the only hostility came from Kent Hovind. But this would pale in comparison to Kent's hostility in his later years. The trial began on October 21st, 2006. A lawyer who worked for a non-profit Christian organization testified that Hovind claimed to have beat the tax system and that he favored cash transactions because they were untraceable and consequently non-taxable. All of which mimics Glenn Stoll's previously mentioned modus operandi. That lawyer's name is David Charles Gibbs III. I have spoken with Mr. Gibbs' law office to invite them for an interview. They declined, but did afford me the liberty to tell you as to why. Simply put, they are concerned about the potential backlash that they could receive from, as they described, some of Kent Hovind's psychotic followers, which is an entirely understandable reason to avoid bringing details back into the spotlight. Though I do want to clarify that they in no way suggested all of Kent Hovind's followers are psychotic, but behavior from some of Kent's following justifies this response, which will be validated later. In the trial, David Charles Gibbs was called as a witness as he had spoken with Kent at his home in the past. Mr. Gibbs testified there was a great deal of what I would call bravado in his claim that he had this reviewed in the past and he had won. He said every attorney that he had look at it claimed that he was right. And I said, "You're telling me a lawyer in the state of Florida signed his name to that you don't have to pay taxes and you don't have to withhold taxes?" And Kent said, "Well, it wasn't in Florida." And I said, "Well, where is this lawyer? I mean, I'd like to see that." He said, "A guy out west." And then I said, "Well, is he a lawyer?" Michelle Heldmeyer then asked, "Did you ever come to learn who that person was that Mr. Hovind was talking about?" To which Mr. Gibbs said, "It was a gentleman. I had never met him personally. I did talk to him on the phone one time. A gentleman by the name of Glenn Stoll." Glenn Stoll, the known tax fraud who is now pleading guilty to conspiracy to defraud the United States. Many claims have been made by Kent Hovind about the trial. Here are a few.
And so when the U.S. attorney who went and seized the church property, John David Roy Atchison, and Miss Heldmeyer, whose husband was involved in pedophilia, when he went to Detroit to have sex with a 5-year-old, he seized all the church property, seized the bank account. A couple weeks later, he flew to Detroit to have sex with a 5-year-old, got arrested, and hung himself in jail. That's the guy who put me in jail, John David Roy Atchison, on the team that went after me. The government broke 100 laws to throw me in prison to shut me up. At sentencing, the judge said, "Mr. Hovind, your crime is worse than rape."
Painstaking of a process as it was, I examined all of the court transcripts for the entirety of the trial. No evidence of these claims can be found anywhere throughout the transcript, nor anywhere else in my research. Yet, Kent has a very convenient excuse for that.
My attorney kept saying, "Hey, where's the transcript? Where's the transcript?" "Well, we're still working on it." Yeah, right. Mm-hmm. They were changing it.
How do you know?
There's changes in the transcript.
Which is ironic because earlier in the same interview, Kent Hovind relies on the transcript in an attempt to validate his position.
If you find out Kent Hovind took out less than $10,000, you must find him guilty, which is not the law.
How do you know he did this?
They read it in court. It's in the transcript. It's part of the trial.
The same transcript that he himself has suggested is edited and faulty. Now, unfortunately, I cannot realistically read through the entire transcripts on screen for the purpose of the documentary. It's hundreds of pages. However, digital copies are available online to be downloaded readily. On the other hand, there are a few key notes worth sharing in regards to the trial. Kent has enjoyed claiming that an attorney named John David Roy Atchison was one of the prosecutors in his case. The reality is that it was Michelle Heldmeyer who was the prosecutor that put Kent in prison. Atchison was involved in one single moment of the case, and that was filing a motion after sentencing had already taken place. Said motion was also withdrawn for being a duplicate of a file that another attorney had already submitted. That's it. That's all Atchison did. And what he did was replaced, yet Kent acts as if Atchison was in the courtroom, working the case, and had a hand in putting him in prison. Why? Why fabricate this narrative? Because, for Kent's agenda of characterizing the court and the government as evil, John David Roy Atchison suits his agenda.
Arrested yesterday at Metro Airport upon arrival from Florida, made his first appearance in Detroit federal court today. According to a deposition from the FBI special agent in charge of the investigation, Atchison told the undercover detective to tell her daughter that, quote, "You found her a sweet boyfriend who will bring her presents."
Atchison was charged with enticement of a minor to engage in sexual activity, aggravated sexual abuse, and traveling across state lines to have sex with someone under the age of 12. Let me be clear. Atchison is scum, and you'll never find me saying otherwise. My stating of the fact that Atchison had no involvement in the case is in no way a means of painting him in a better light or anything of that nature. The simple fact is that Atchison is useful for Kent's narrative, and it's why he wants to pull focus to that lie. Another claim that, in recent years, Kent has mentioned less and less is that Judge Casey Rogers made the claim that Kent's crimes were worse than rape. Yet, after reading through the entirety of the transcripts, no such quote can be found, to which Kent will rely on his convenient excuse that the transcript has been doctored. Now, that's not to say that something similar hadn't been said, because the truth is, there was, but it comes from Eric Hovind, Kent's son. Addressing the court, Eric Hovind said the following: "I'm looking into your face and I realize that you gave my dad 10 years in prison, and that's okay. I realize that this court considered my dad and what he did worse than a rapist, and that's okay. I also understand that the heart of the king, as Daniel 4 says, is in God's hand. If the heart of the king is in God's hand, then I can assure you the heart of the judges and the heart of everybody else in here is in God's hand, and God's will is going to be done."
So I just pulled out the quote from the transcript here where the judge says, "I received letters from many of you," and at this point she's speaking to everyone who's in the audience, just the people who came to observe like me. "I received letters from many of you expressing the view that sometimes those convicted of heinous crimes are subject to less time than Mr. Hovind is facing in this case. This is a serious case, serious charges, serious conduct. Make no mistake about it. By your conduct in this case, Mr. Hovind, in my opinion, you dishonored the men and the women in our military, you dishonored your fellow Americans, and you've dishonored the Constitution of the United States." And that is the only thing that she said regarding this particular section about a heinous crime. And that was in regard to Kent Hovind's sentencing. And Eric that day had stood up and was a character witness for his father. And then the next day was Joe's sentencing, and Eric again stood up as a character witness for his mother. And when he stood up for Joe Hovind, his mother, he said that he reminded the judge that it had been his honor to speak on his father's behalf at his trial, but that he considered this occasion to speak on behalf of his mother to be 10 times that honor. "Justice has to be blind," Eric stated, as he agreed with the judge sentencing his father to a sentence worse than that of a rapist. He said that this whole trial was really meant for Kent to be made the example of, and that Joe didn't need to be used in that same way. So Kent was the only one who ever used the word rapist, and he...
Sorry, you mean Eric?
I'm sorry, Eric was the only one who ever used the word rapist. The judge did not.
Eric made that statement, not Judge Casey Rogers. The primary reason Kent was sent to prison was for the crime of structuring. What is structuring? Simply put, structuring involves the practice of withdrawing or depositing money just beneath the amount of $10,000 with the intent to avoid the bank filing a report which could result in taxes owed. Simplified further, it is a means of avoiding paying taxes, which, as should be abundantly evident by now, is one of Kent's primary motivations. Structuring is not a complex crime, it's actually quite easy to understand. Yet, Kent has either exhaustively tried to mischaracterize the concept of structuring, or simply lacked the mental capacity to understand it. I cannot factually claim either way, but the evidence suggests the former, which then supports the idea that while Kent might not lack the mental capacity to understand how structuring works, he lacked the mental capacity to see that feigning ignorance was not going to work. Kent has repeatedly tried to characterize structuring as a crime of not making a deposit or withdrawal to the amount of $10,000, and he adds to this by saying that by that description, everyone is guilty of structuring since the vast majority of people do not make deposits or withdrawals of $10,000, especially on a regular basis. In the interview with Bogdan Chichenko, Bogdan pushes back on Kent on the subject of structuring, providing this interaction.
What happened with the structuring, if the speed limit was 70 and you got stopped for going 69, and they said, you're avoiding...
What if you were stopped for 71?
Well, no, if you got stopped for... I did not go over 10,000. We took out $9,500.
Structuring is kind of going...
That's like saying, I'm going to give you a ticket for going 69 because you're thinking about going over 70. I'm not going over 70.
Because of the structure law, it's more like this. The speed limit is 70, but I'm going 73 because I know nobody will really do anything.
That is not that is bad analogy. I did not take over $10,000 out of the bank.
As previously stated, withdrawing or depositing funds below $10,000 is not by default structuring. It requires further investigation to identify intent. In an example from Kent Hovind's withdrawals, Kent required $30,000 in order to put a down payment on a house he wanted to purchase. There is a process put in place that allows individuals to retrieve large amounts of money, but in doing so, the bank files a report, which can then lead to taxes owed. So, Kent specifically retrieved the amount in 3 withdrawals totaling $9,000 and 1 withdrawal of $3,000. There is no practical reason to withdraw the money through this process unless seeking to avoid the bank filing a report. This, among a multitude of repeated transactions just under $10,000, shows a pattern of behavior indicative with the intent of structuring. Partner this with the fact that Kent worked with Glenn Stoll, a known tax protester who required his clients to contact him if they want to make any withdrawal over $10,000, who is now pleading guilty to conspiracy to defraud the United States. It may seem accurate to quote attorney David Charles Gibbs when he directly said to Kent, "Just because you might get away with it doesn't make it right." Hovind has repeatedly attempted to paint the picture that he was a sweet, innocent, gentle preacher who was willing to openly cooperate with the investigation and trial. Yet, the evidence of Kent's behavior clearly shows otherwise. As discussed, Hovind was hostile towards the IRS agents, telling his followers not to cooperate with their agents, questioning what the agents would do if he physically attacked them. And after the search warrant had been executed, Kent Hovind forced those working for him to sign a non-disclosure agreement. If the workers refused to sign, they would not be allowed to work for Creation Science Evangelism, Kent's ministry. Further, Hovind had sent a letter to Agent Snyder attempting to order him not to speak with any of his workers, saying that Snyder could only talk to him. Workers who were called in to testify during the trial were afraid to due to Kent's aggressive insistence towards the non-disclosure agreement. Kent had been told by multiple people over time from a multitude of fields and positions that he was wrong. The IRS and even Christians like Rebecca Horton, Chad Hovind, and David Charles Gibbs tried to explain this to him. None of this changed Kent's behavior. He refused to be wrong and refused to accept responsibility for anything, which is characterized perfectly by one of Kent's most ridiculous statements during the trial.
Who exactly is charging me with doing what? When they came and arrested me, I said, What did I do?
To such an extent that when the presiding magistrate judge asked Hovind if he wrote and spoke English, Hovind responded, to some degree. Kent Hovind, who has conducted hundreds, if not thousands of sermons and seminars, each close to an hour long and up to 3 hours long, all in the English language for decades, claimed he only spoke English to some degree. But to hear Kent tell it, it's everyone else who are lying. However, despite all of this, the most disturbing thing that came from Kent's trial that actually happened was a phone call. During a recorded phone call in prison, Kent denies guilt over and over, but the part of the call that frustrates me is one of Kent's key moments that inspired this documentary. It was Joe Hovind's moment of insecurity.
So cheer up. It's going to be fine. Can you do that?
I want, for me, it's even just having a hope, and I just don't have that right now. I don't have a hope that's going to be different in our marriage when you get out, because I'm just hearing things that sound all the same, you know. And
maybe I need to change. Or maybe you need to change and accept it. Say, hey, that's the way he is, that's the way God made him, so I'm going to love him that way. I mean, that's the other hope. Your hope is always that I will change. Maybe the hope ought to be that you will adapt.
Yes, sir.
Another option, you know.
Maybe you should adapt. Joe Hovind was scared. She was terrified of what was about to happen. What she was wanting in that moment was some strength from her husband. What she wanted was to stop hearing the same old, it's gonna be fine, everything is fine, when the very blatant truth she was seeing was that everything was not going to be fine. She turned to her husband for support, and instead, he treats her like some annoying, subpar subordinate. And she responds with the sickening yes sir that Kent undoubtedly instilled in her to speak to him with. And in the end, Joe Hovind was also sentenced to 1 year in prison by following her husband's lead and doing as he says, by submitting to her husband, as Kent so often has reminded that the Bible says to do.
How could you not want to serve somebody who would do that for you? How can you not want to dedicate everything you've got?
Kent was in prison for 9 years. His attitude towards women may not have started in a good place to begin with, but from my perspective, it seems to have only worsened over the years. And I believe I see a connection. Rebecca Horton reported Kent to the IRS. Michelle Heldmeyer was the person who prosecuted Kent. Judge Casey Rogers sentenced Kent Hovind to 10 years in prison. And Joe Hovind doubted and divorced Kent. More women in the future would only add to the list of strong women with the backbone to tell Kent the one thing he hates more than anything. No, you can't do that. You don't get to do whatever you want. You can't treat people any way that you please. You don't get to get away with it. Whether it's criminally evading the IRS or paying a simple $50 permit, Kent refuses to be told what he has to do. In Kent's mind, he is the authority. He can do what he wants. He is better than you.
Watch, I've done Whack an Atheist for a long time before I ever heard of you. You're not special. Okay, sorry.
He believes he is smarter than you.
I would like you to find that teacher, and I will debate you and that teacher simultaneously. Half my brain tied behind my back.
And what these women did was show him just how defenseless, weak, unintelligent, and unremarkable he really is. Which only makes this statement from Kent about his fourth wife a form of validity to this hypothesis.
Some people argue about everything. Praise God for Sandra. She doesn't argue about anything. She just wants to be wife. Honey, is it warm in here? Oh, whatever you think, honey. Where were you raised at? Can we get some more of you? I got to know a lot of guys want one like you. Okay.
Kent Hovind has a multitude of weaknesses, but one of his most prominent is his lack of a spine. Spineless men try to squirm their way out of consequences. Spineless men talk down to their wives when she is scared. And yet, we have not explored just how low Kent can be.
Good evening, folks. Kent Hovind here. April 21st, 2016. A day to remember. Write this date down someplace. Amazing things happened today. We got the property for Dinosaur Adventure Land. We are headed for the property in Alabama. I don't know how to edit all this stuff, so we're going to do a whole series of real short YouTube clips. So we're going to take our Suzuki Bergman 650 scooter all the way up to the property, and then we're going to show you Dinosaur Adventure Land. All right, after you get north of the town of Lenox, you come down beautiful tree-covered Pearl Lane for about a quarter mile, and the property's on the left. This will be the grand entrance to Dinosaur Adventure Land. We started Dinosaur Adventure Land just 77 days ago now. If you want to come help us build, come on down. Let me give you a tour real quick of our Dinosaur Adventure Land. Follow me. If you can't come and swing a hammer, pay for those who will. We figured up today, Roger, who was it working with today on the cost to finish everything we got going? About $100,000 would finish everything. Listen, God made the world. Just quit running from him and say, God, Kent's right. You made this place. You made me, and I surrender to you. It's a simple flip of the switch in the brain. This is your world, God. I'm created by you. I answer to you. You made the rules. I'm sorry. Would you forgive me? It's so simple. Quit being so stubborn and bullheaded and say, okay, God, you can have me.
After Kent Hovind's 9 years in prison, he was met by his family who brought him home to Pensacola, where Kent would spend the remainder of his prison sentence in home confinement. A party was held where many came to celebrate Kent's release, but according to Kent, the day did not end on a high note.
Some people get mad at me because my wife divorced me. In Florida, you can't stop it. I say, look, I didn't divorce anybody. I slept in a separate bedroom for 9 months after I got home from 8.5 years of prison.
Given Kent's habit of lying, I question just about everything he claims. That said, Jo Hovind and I have talked for the past few years. Though she has opted out of doing an interview, her opinion towards Kent makes Kent's claims seem believable. And who could blame her? Jo Hovind was raised that women are to do as their husbands say, which was reinforced with Kent's affirmation of that mentality. Jo Hovind did as Kent said, and for that, she was sentenced to 1 year in prison. 1 year away from her children, her friends, her life. And all Kent offered her was scorning her for doubting him and being upset with him. Going back to the call that was shared between Kent and Jo in prison, Jo Hovind mentions the following.
I want, for me, it's even just having a hope, and I just don't have that right now. I don't have a hope that's going to be different in our marriage when you get out.
Clearly indicating that problems existed between Jo and Kent before there were problems with the IRS. Since Jo was in prison for 1 year and Kent was in prison for 9, this provided Jo with 8 years without her domineering, ill-mannered husband Kent. 8 years of freedom. 8 years of seeing what her life could be like without Kent. 8 years of not being spoken to like an object. A thing to do as Kent commands. But years passed, and Kent was released from prison, coming home to his wife. Her concerns of nothing changing were validated almost instantly upon Kent Hovind's release from prison, as he began his mission to rebuild Dinosaur Adventure Land. Kent had no intention of making a change to his life because Kent still maintains the position that he did nothing wrong. Though I have not found a specific day when Kent Hovind announced his position to rebuild Dinosaur Adventure Land, I do know that on December 9th, 2015, Kent announced that he was earnestly searching for a property on which to build. He looked at many areas across Alabama and Mississippi, only 5 months after being in prison for 9 years for the criminal activities of the previous Dinosaur Adventure Land. 4 months after the announcement that they were looking for property on April 21st, 2016, an individual purchased property for Kent Hovind in Lenox, Alabama, in order for Kent to recreate Dinosaur Adventure Land. No longer was it just a possibility. It was happening. A new Dinosaur Adventure Land was going to be built, being run by the same man, Kent Hovind, who denies he did anything wrong, who hasn't changed any of his positions, whose actions resulted in him going to prison for 9 years. On June 24th, 2016, 2 months after remaking Dinosaur Adventure Land was confirmed, Joe Hovind filed for divorce from Kent. It's important to understand something about Joe. Following her husband's lead is one of the beliefs she holds dear. Of course, she would prefer the husband to be leading her in a moral, legal manner, but she genuinely thinks that she should submit to her husband. This is a fundamental belief of hers that shapes her perception of marriage, and equally fundamental is her avoidance of the subject of divorce. She was with Kent for decades, putting up with his behavior and being spoken to like an object, because she believed divorce was not right. So, while some may be rejoicing at Joe Hovind divorcing Kent, and rightfully so, you also need to keep in mind that this was one of the hardest decisions she has ever made.
As you know, my wife divorced me. I didn't divorce anybody. I was in divorce court for 6 minutes. The judge said, "You want this divorce?" "Yes." "Okay." Sign the paper, out the door. On the way out, I said, "Would you marry me?" She said, "You gotta be kidding."
Some offered their sympathies to Kent, even some who dislike him because a divorce is often a heart-wrenching thing to go through, but not for Kent. Because just 2 months after the divorce was finalized, Kent and Mary Toko are seen together on August 7th and August 8th, holding hands, which they tried to pass off as praying. Even with these images aside, on August 18th, standing on the gazebo that was specifically being built for the wedding ceremony for Kent and Mary, Kent was seen practicing his wedding kiss with a mannequin. 3 months later, on September 4th, Mary and Kent have their wedding. Though it is noted that this wasn't an official marriage, this was, as Mary describes, a marriage in the eyes of the Lord. However, it is immaterial to the point of the documentary of whether or not Kent was legally married to Mary or not. While Joe suffered internal conflict and pain at the thought of going against her fundamental beliefs and filed for divorce, Kent was on to wife number 2 within a couple of months.
If they depart, what do? You move on. It's not good that the man should be alone. So if you've been divorced, someone left you or you left them, no matter, try to get your own heart straight first, but move on. It's not good that the man be alone. For heaven's sake, do something. Quit crying over spilled milk.
This brings me back to the phone call between Kent and Joe Hovind in prison. He speaks to her with such disappointment, having no care for her feelings whatsoever. He dismissed Joe, and from that moment, Kent seems to have dismissed his children entirely as well. Kent's efforts were to now essentially wipe the slate clean and start over, not moaning over spilled milk. A new wife, new Dinosaur Adventure Land, new friends, and new volunteers. Building anything from the ground up is hard, especially when you're doing so on a volunteer basis. Since arriving at Lenox, Alabama, on the property he was gifted rather than earning it for himself, Kent has survived off of donations of either money or items of interest. Kent readily makes requests for certain items, with the rare occurrence of offering to purchase other items, which tend to be the things of high monetary value, like vehicles or heavy machinery. But the preference is to simply have things given to him, feeding off of the productive members of society who have earned the items he is requesting. This became a point of contention between Mary and Kent. In a phone conversation between her and I, we discussed her frustration with Kent's disinterest in running the ministry with efficiency and scalability. She mentioned that she would note to Kent that he has the financial resources to have professionals come to the property and build the things he needs built properly to where they will last. Yet Kent has no interest in paying people to do much of anything and would rather people show up and do it for free. As a result, it takes years for anything to get done. Here is what the Lenox property looked like originally. And here is what it is today. Like the Dinosaur Adventure Land before it, it's not much of anything. But comparing the Lenox property before to what it is now, there is in fact a difference that has been made. Yet, when you realize it took them over 5 years just to accomplish this, the progress made is certainly diminished. Kent could have a steady revenue stream in place for his ministry, but to allow for scalable growth, Kent would have to operate the ministry in a manner that would involve Kent abiding by rules, which we know Kent is diametrically opposed to doing. Due to Kent's refusal to run Dinosaur Adventure Land in any legitimate official capacity, the ones who end up suffering the most are the volunteers. Sierra Hammond, at the time of volunteering at Dinosaur Adventure Land, was just 18 years old. Writing about her experience, she describes mistreatment and hostility at Dinosaur Adventure Land. The full article is available to be read, but I will summarize here. Sierra explains,
I did all of the domestic work that would ordinarily be associated with running a household, but for the camp, not just however many people you may have in your home. This included menu planning, grocery shopping, cooking, cleaning the kitchen, bathrooms, and dining area, doing laundry, etc. As I was there longer and longer, the group size would get bigger and smaller. I think at most, I had 50 people to feed, but the average was between 20 and 25. However, as time went on, things began to change around Dinosaur Adventure Land. The peaceful atmosphere became stressed as we all got tired and began to become overworked. What I was doing and the way I had been doing it became scrutinized, and I was treated like an employee. I was told I could delegate my work and to manage others as well, but I was the only young lady who was reliably there to do the domestic work. Just before I left, they expected a hot breakfast at 6 a.m. Muffins or something made the day before were not acceptable. They wanted bacon, eggs, toast, etc. every morning, meaning I needed to be in the kitchen by 4:30 a.m., a hot lunch prepared at noon, and a homemade dinner at 6 p.m. If you were doing this for a small number of people, that would perhaps be possible. But as mentioned before, I was the only girl there most of the summer, and I would have anywhere from 14 to 50 people to feed, usually around 25. We would also have a mandatory meeting at 7 a.m. every morning and 8 p.m. every night to do the Bible study, and have a general meeting. The 8 p.m. meeting sometimes could run an hour or more, but breakfast was still expected bright and early every single morning without fail, in addition to the other 2 meals and cleaning around the camp, kitchen, bathrooms, and dining areas. I did most of the work by hand. I did all of the dishes for all the people by hand. One night, the evening before my friend I mentioned was scheduled to depart, I did not catch up on all the dishes. I was sad he was leaving and planned to do them in the morning, so I could spend that evening with him. Dr. Hovind was gone for the week preaching somewhere, and Steve, his right-hand man, was left in charge. I went to sleep that night and planned to do it immediately in the morning. Around 4:30 a.m., Steve came into the girls' bunkhouse where Lene, myself, and a friend of mine from Ohio were sleeping, angry that the dishes were not done. He brought me to the kitchen and, using extremely colorful language ill-fit for a man of God, basically told me I better run this kitchen like an industrial kitchen and keep it clean, or they would find someone else who could. I was shocked. I did my best to keep up, but it was a very big job for anyone to try and tackle alone. I was also appalled that he went into the girls' bunkhouse early in the morning uninvited. We could have been in any array of undress. I was also upset at the expectation to run it like an industrial kitchen. If I had an industrial kitchen to work with, of course I could, but I had far from that. Just a stove, a microwave, a shop sink, 2 refrigerators, and a hope of the promise that they would build me a proper kitchen in the pole barn. I spent hours a day simply trying to keep up with the dishes. 25 people times 3 meals a day without a dishwasher is very overwhelming. The treatment of women was atrocious. I would be told I may delegate some of my extensive tasks to others, but I would then be told that I could not make any of the men help me because it was woman's work, and that if they wanted to help me after they put in a day's labor, that would be okay. Obviously, there were not very many men willing to help, as they were all tired and worn down by the end of the day. Dr. Hovind was extremely stubborn about it, to the point that he would come into the kitchen and ask for a drink but would not get it himself if Bethany, Lene, I, or any other girl was there to do it for him. And after meals, he would not even bring his plate to the sink. The behavior spread to the other men, and soon several of them were leaving their plates behind for me to clean up. He also suggested that the men give me their laundry to do, and I would do it for them. I obviously was already very busy each day, and on top of that, at first we only had 1 washing machine. We eventually got a dryer as well, but most of the summer had to line dry everything. We never got more than 1 regular household washing machine, with which we were expected to keep up with the whole camp's laundry.
Sierra eventually left, rightfully feeling that this was too much work for her to handle, but her mistreatment was not the only case. Hannah Deborah once assisted the ministry from an admin position. This is what she had to say.
While there are many things I like about Kent, I have found him to be narcissistic in the extreme, except when he wants to put on a humble front for certain things. Arrogant, quick to jump to the next topic without fully covering the current one, avoids topics he doesn't like, and doesn't accept correction, just comes back with a counter-argument to make his point look undeniably right. Many times my parents warned me that he wasn't doing right and that I should step down, but I felt bad leaving him hanging without someone to take care of the thousands of emails he'd receive a week, so I kept going and defended his good points. As thanks for the work I did, I had to deal with, of all things, the very unwelcome advertising of myself as a single woman to anybody out there who might be interested in me on YouTube, which I found, for a so-called man of God, very inappropriate and shocking behavior coming from somebody who is so intelligent and is so strong in the faith. That was so foolish and showed his complete lack of wisdom and discernment. I asked him very nicely not to do that, and he'd stop for a while and then conveniently forget and do it again. That was a huge turn-off for me as a young woman trying to stay behind the scenes and avoid the stalkers. I guess all we can do now is pray for him and drop our support.
Many have mentioned the overbearing management and the ridiculously long hours of work, to which Kent's only response to this is, they can go elsewhere. However, volunteers are not alone in the poor management and safety at Dinosaur Adventure Land, because a child died on Kent's property, drowning in one of the lakes. It was a horrible situation, and the appropriate response is to offer condolences, perhaps enact some safety procedures to ensure this doesn't happen again, and be there for the family. But not in Kent's mind.
We had this last Sunday rumors going around the internet about an accidental drowning here at Dinosaur Adventure Land, and it's true. There was a family with 5 kids, twin 7-year-olds, all playing in the lake together. The water was 3 feet deep. Suddenly the dad noticed that Stephen, the 7-year-old, was gone, and he apparently slipped on the dock and hit his head. Nobody saw it. We don't know, but he did drown in our lake. And we tried, your wife is a medical doctor, and she's right there on the scene as soon as he got him out of the water. We don't know how long he was underwater, but she gave him CPR, did everything right, took him to the hospital. Anyway, the kids had a blast here, and the dad wants to bring all the kids back and loves the place. What do? You know, kids do dumb things once in a while, and the dad's thrilled with the ministry, wants to come back, going to support us and all that. So,
to Kent, it was the appropriate time to mention that the child did something stupid, despite admitting he didn't see what happened. Because if the child did something stupid, he is even further away from blame. And of course, an opportunity was not missed to claim just how much people love Dinosaur Adventure Land, and shift away from the tragedy of the child dying and returns to focusing on himself. A child died, but the extent of his remorse to the death of a child seems to mimic his mentality towards divorce.
For heaven's sake, do something. Quit crying over spilled milk.
But Kent's mentality towards children is reflected perfectly in this comment.
Yes, that's not our kids. You can always make another one. Okay.
The world had largely forgotten Kent, and he was struggling to find relevance once again. So the solution was simple. Debates. People were not looking for Kent Hovind anymore. But around 2016 to 2017, the debate sphere on YouTube was on fire. And even more so into 2018. This presented an opportunity for Kent to get his name back out there, and in a far more direct manner than he had in the past. By engaging in more and more debates, Hovind was able to leech off of other audiences to gain him some attention and views. Videos that only included Kent and that weren't talking about someone else received very little attention, though Kent likes to act as if he has a massive audience, and it is instead others who try to leech off of his channel, which he explains here.
They want to be you. I think they envy my popularity.
Plainly speaking, he goes looking for a fight. And when someone replies back with a video of their own, and they have a smaller number of subscribers than Kent, he's all too prepared to point out his 194,000 subscribers. Yet, the math behind his channel tells a different story, showcasing that his relevance has drastically faded. Kent's average viewership is 4.8%. That is extremely low. To put that in context, 95.2% of Kent's subscribers don't even watch him. For a more accurate view of the amount of people who actually still care about Kent Hovind's existence, You need only look at his second YouTube channel, Dinosaur Adventure Land, which has a merely 5,000 subscribers. Now, though I am doubting that Kent will be making a response video to this documentary, in the event that he does, it is likely that he will point out that I have fewer subscribers than him. At the time of this recording, I have 2,200 subscribers. Nothing to boast about. But one key difference is that my channel was merely 3 months into its existence. Nor was I once a speaker for Christianity. Nor was I all over the news for 45 felony counts of structuring that put me in prison for 9 years, and that blasted my name with links all over the internet. It's just me. Kent's delusions of grandeur rest on a foundation more fragile than a Pringles chip, reinforced only by the audience of people that are on Kent Hovind's compound, many of which who would be homeless if they were asked to leave should they point out any of the flaws that Kent has. It's the debates and response videos that he and others make that are keeping Kent somewhat relevant. But it dangles on a thread. Kent has debated a multitude of individuals in the recent years, but one of the most prominent, at least for Kent, was his debate with Aaron Ra. I sat down with Aaron Ra to ask him a few questions. Kent Hovind is a bit of a controversial figure, even among other creationists, and has been so for decades. When did you first become aware of Kent Hovind, and at what point did you decide that you wanted to address the claims he was making?
Round about Y2K was when I first came across Kent Hovind, when other people were arguing with me online on places like Talk.Origins, which back in the days of Usenet was the place that you would argue creation versus evolution. People were telling me that there was this guy with a $250,000 award for anybody that has evidence of evolution.
In that very actually same debate, some were mentioning that you were overbearing and interrupting Kent quite a bit. How do you respond to that perspective, people who have that opinion?
It was never agreed to equal time. First off, it was billed that it wasn't supposed to be a debate. It was supposed to be a discussion. And I was not, and the reason for that was because I am not going to let him set up his straw man and then force me to defend his error. So when he talks about his 6 levels of evolution that he made up out of his own ignorance, I'm not playing that game. I just want to, I want people to understand, I'm not trying to show disrespect. I'm trying to show that I have absolutely no respect for this convicted fraud and charlatan who has spent he's made his lifetime out of lying to children and misleading donors.
What advice do you offer to those who are seeking to debate him or engage with him in any capacity?
I just did a 30-part series a few months ago on his favorite seminar, the one that he cites all the time. And I disproved everything he said therein. And I said, now that I've done this, I'm done with him. And we all should be. We know that he's gotten nothing right, ever. He's been absolutely wrong about absolutely everything for 30 years. Let it go. But people still want to talk to him. 2-3 days ago, I was interviewed by a rabbinical school. There was a rabbi that wanted me to speak to his students. That they were looking for the other side of the issue because they were discussing creationism, and they had already interviewed Kent Hovind. And it's not like there's a creationist that you could talk to that would give you a truthful or accurate description of anything. But, you know, in a way, I could almost appreciate that they went to Hovind first. Because if you don't want your students to believe in creationism, let them interview Hovind. He will be the biggest turnoff. As a matter of fact, there was a number of the students that told me when I got to talk to them that the thing that turned them off about him was the arrogance of his ignorance. He is the Dunning-Kruger spokesmodel. He is the depiction of narcissism.
Kent, having lost his family, his friends, his original Dinosaur Adventure Land, his reputation, and respect, Hovind had to make new friends. On December 20th, 2016, A man by the name of Brady Byram created a series of videos titled Kent Hovind is Innocent, a series roughly 13 hours long. Very few have watched the series to completion, or even watched the series at all, assumingly due to its poor construction and the introduction disclaimer. In the disclaimer, Brady claims to be a paralegal forensic investigator and analyst, a description that is actually 3 different fields of expertise, all requiring further education and practice, and all of which Brady has none of. Further, within the first minute you are able to see the level of professionalism behind this paralegal forensic investigator with his spelling error of human as hunin. Yet, Kent has since adopted Brady Byram's claim that the government broke 100 laws to put Kent in prison, despite Kent himself admitting, as the rest of us readily do, to have not watched Brady Byram's series of videos. If anyone should have watched them, it should be Kent, but being able to provide validity to the claim isn't Kent's concern. Kent simply wants to surround himself with people who agree with him, regardless if they can prove their claims. Due to Kent's criminal past, hostility, and frequent divorces, Kent is left with very few individuals to befriend, leaving him only those who are largely undesirable people to associate with. Brady is seen at Dinosaur Adventure Land regularly, though he lives here in Texas. His background is colorful, to say the least. Brady's family claims he molested his own children for years, and has since been disassociated from them, rightfully so. Yet, this is not Byram's only instance where his actions are concerning. Back in Mesquite, Texas, Brady Byram once worked as a Dallas County jailer, but one day was arrested during a routine traffic stop, where officers found several guns and 2 explosives in his vehicle. What he intended to do is not known, but thankfully, no one was injured. This is who Kent views as a friend, and someone he chooses to associate himself with. But Byram is not the only friend of Kent's that is a cause for concern. Chris Jones, as of March 10th, 2008, is a registered sex offender against minors, where substantial evidence was found of Chris Jones touching innocent boys in a strip poker game. Kent is aware of this, says it's false, and continues his relationship with Chris to this day.
That baggage from the past, and they're going to use it against the ministry.
So what is that? Yeah, the Christian perspective, Chris was my friend. I knew him before this happened. And, Saul was out killing people, and after he got saved, some of the church probably didn't want to accept him in there. I mean, I feel it's a similar thing here,
And I understand what you're saying, but again, the laws will be used against you when Chris shows up. And that's why those with children, they have to exercise, they have to kind of exercise some caution and kind of stay away from him and act as if, it's again, the best thing is Chris as a Christian would be for him to come and have lunch with you or go out to eat with you or socialize with you, but kind of stay away from the ministry. I think it's actually illegal for him to be there. And I think that if the Alabama Children's Resources ever catches him there, I think they're going to arrest him.
I don't think so, but maybe we can do some checking on that. If he's going to move here and live here, yes. But to come visit?
To come visit, he can't even be around the school, brother. If he's around where children are and non-location of children is a convicted pedophile, he's in violation of his rules, what he was left with when he was set free.
Kent has also stated that Chris Jones is allowed at Dinosaur Adventure Land anytime. And it's important to remember, Dinosaur Adventure Land is built for children. Chris Jones was on the property at least once, bringing with him a kid known as Zaire, seen in this video.
Wait, you're not done yet. You're not done yet. Come on, you got to be a movie star right here. Look at the camera and say hi, Mom.
Hey.
Okay.
In a text conversation with Paul Hansen, Paul admits that Chris Jones and Zaire slept in the same bed together in Paul's house. This is who Kent defends. The caliber of friends that Kent keeps around suggests to me that Kent merely cares about a few things and how he chooses his friends. Do you like him? Do they mostly agree with him? Are they loyal to him? Do they keep their mouths shut? Kent has been shown to be an unremarkable, spineless man, but since his release in prison, one of the most documented weaknesses of Kent's is that he is pathologically selfish. Kent admitted to no wrongdoing in his court trial, and never will because he is selfish, poisoned with a deep victim mentality. All Kent cared about, and still cares about, is what Kent wants. Within 2 months of Joe divorcing him, Kent found a new wife. That is not the action of a man who is distraught or conflicted or in pain. He doesn't care what pain or struggle he puts you through. To be in Kent's life means your role is simple, and Kent describes it best.
So Sarah's the only one listed as a model wife to look at. Now, Sarah's husband, Abram, asked her to do some pretty dumb things some couple of times, pretty dangerous things. She was a gorgeous woman, and he went into a foreign country and said, look, tell them you're my sister. Twice he did that, didn't he? Okay, honey. He asked her to do something that was, frankly, I think, dumb and dangerous, and it was to save his own hide. But she said, okay. Now, a good private knows you do what the sergeant says. You don't have to understand. You don't have to agree. Yes, sir. Let's go. And a godly wife says, yes, sir, honey.
The same expectations are imposed on his friend like Brady Byram, Ernie Land, and Chris Jones, which haunts me to think what is in store for Sandra Hovind's future, Kent's fourth wife. Kent doesn't care about the well-being of his volunteers, of the visitors, his wives, or the children who are at risk from the friends that Kent keeps. All that matters is, what do they do for Kent? His unpleasantness knows no bounds, it seems, and the worst of Kent had yet to come. Marriage is hard in many ways, even in a healthy, loving relationship. Two people agree to spend their lives together, and life is hard, so tough times are bound to happen in every marriage. But hard times does not then mean a divorce is imminent. Divorce happens for a multitude of reasons, and if there was anyone who is familiar with divorce, it's Kent Hovind. It seems that not many women can stand to be Miss Hovind for long, and the reasons all stem from Kent Hovind. In July of 2017, Mary Tocco left Kent Hovind. Unlike Joe, who was married to Kent for decades, Mary was not about to waste years of her life with a man who could likely damage her future with the financial and legal concerns that Mary had uncovered. With Mary gone, Kent was again without a wife. Kent is diametrically opposed to the idea of a man not having a wife, as he has often referenced the following verse.
Let them marry. It's better to marry than to burn. Here again, Paul's giving advice. Having a partner, a marriage partner, is extremely important. That's the first thing God said to Adam. It's not good that he be alone.
This further illustrates Kent's views on women. For Kent, a wife seems to be an item that he acquires simply based upon an entitled mentality that he has, which explains the short periods of time between wives after the many divorces he has had. Before Mary, he was alone for just 2 months. After Mary left, Kent was alone for a year until he was seen in the summer of 2018 wearing a wedding ring once again. Kent had found a third wife in Cindy Lincoln, who happened to be Mary Tocco's friend, who lived on the Dinosaur Adventure Land property at the same time as Mary. Over time, Cindy and Kent grew close, leading to an equally illegitimate marriage that was merely referred to as a marriage in the eyes of God. At first, things seemed to be going well for the two of them. Cindy had a large inheritance from her father exceeding $100,000. money that she loaned to Kent to assist with the ministry, and in return, Kent would provide her a monthly income until the money had been paid back. The marriage lasted longer than 10 months, so for Kent, this was certainly looking to be working out. But Kent's happiness with his wives is instantly hindered the moment they begin to shed light on things Kent wishes to ignore. Joe shed light on Kent's behavior, Mary shed light on Kent's ministry operations, and Cindy began shedding light on Kent's staff. It started with Cindy noticing some concerning things about a man named Steve Lynn. Steve has been called Kent's right-hand man. Apart from assisting the ministry with tech issues, Steve is often put in charge around Dinosaur Adventure Land while Kent is gone. As Sierra Hammond pointed out in her testimony, he behaves poorly towards others, and especially so when Kent is not around, and has been known to have a problem with drugs and alcohol. Though I'm sure Steve does help out around the property in capacities other than assisting with tech issues, it's been noted by several individuals that the work requirement for staying at Dinosaur Adventure Land is largely overlooked when it comes to Steve. Cindy is not the only person who has noticed these problems. She is simply the one who spoke out. And that is precisely why Kent began to treat Cindy so harshly, because the moment Cindy had the courage to speak up, so did others.
I think that we all gathered to try to show you that we are here for the right reason. And we're all concerned that he's here, even if it's just for today.
Why are you concerned that he's here?
Because we don't
Because
trust
we
him.
don't trust him, Doc.
Oh yeah, I don't either.
You shouldn't be with
So
him.
why is he here, Dr. Hovind?
For a while, Steve was indeed kicked off campus, but the fact that it was Cindy who brought these genuine concerns to light was enough to establish Kent's resentment towards her. This resentment only worsened once Steve was allowed to come back to the property and Cindy once again spoke out. Kent's retaliation against Cindy started by taking Cindy off of landscaping work, to which gardening is one of Cindy's passions. It makes her happy. He instead put her to work in the Dinosaur Adventure Land Creation Center. This involved giving tours of the Creation Center, but tours did not happen regularly. The rest of her work was to be done at home, essentially isolating her from everyone. To further separate her from the rest of the volunteers and staff, Kent mandated that if anybody helped Cindy with her work or talked with her, they would be kicked off the Dinosaur Adventure Land property. This mimics the behavior of Kent's that I disclosed earlier, back in the early 2000s after the IRS executed the search warrant on Kent's old Dinosaur Adventure Land. Kent tried to minimize communication through the enforcement of non-disclosure agreements and requesting the investigators to only speak with him. Notice, none of these actions that Kent makes towards the problems are not directed at himself in any way. They are instead all about silencing any and all opposition against him, without once self-reflecting if he is the one needing to change.
Your hope is always that I will change. Maybe the hope ought to be that you will adapt.
For quite a while, Cindy put up with this behavior and being isolated from everyone else. But eventually, things became far worse. Things turned from passive-aggressive to hostile in nature. Cindy claims that Steve Lynn threatened her with a gun, though in the interest of fairness to Kent and Steve, this has not been verified. Cindy admits that she did not see a gun, but rather claims that it was concealed in his pocket. She is convinced it was a gun, but another event of history is not shrouded in mystery. It's the letter that Brady Byram sent to Cindy Lincoln. Cindy reads through the entirety of the letter, and a link to that video is in the description, but there are key parts in this letter that I feel compelled to highlight here. According to Brady in the letter, Kent asked Brady to write to Cindy. He makes the claim that he believes Cindy to be tormented in the brain, and even extends such a diagnosis to all women, saying, "I've never been a woman, but apparently y'all are psychologically wired to have the capacity to remember offenses more. And that alone makes me sometimes wonder if being a woman isn't almost some kind of mental ailment in and of itself." Brady tells Cindy to shut up 9 times and shut her mouth a few more times. He demeans her over and over, patronizing her, and further tries to diagnose her as bipolar. He recognizes her depression, but belittles her for this, rather than realizing Kent's, Brady's, Ernie's, and Steve's behavior are the things making her depressed. The message of the letter to Cindy is simple. Keep your mouth shut. Don't talk about her problems, or Kent's problems, ever again. Just be silent. I contacted Brady Byram a few months ago, and though I did not lie about who I was speaking to him in a manner that gave off the impression that I was on his side and Kent's side. I felt this was the best approach to get him to talk. In our conversation, the subject of the letter was brought up. This is what Brady had to say.
Hello?
Yes, Mr. Byram.
Yes, it is. It's me.
I'm looking for someone to defend Kent Hovind. I spoke to you last time about a documentary.
I don't recall the phone call nor my response. How long did we talk there?
We talked a bit because the focus was, or for you anyway, of course, was Kent's legal issues, like in terms of tax with the whole series you did. But that's not actually the point of the documentary. So I don't want to get too bogged down into the tax thing.
What other topic is there?
Well, all right, there's quite a bit. I mean, for example, the recent thing with Cindy Lincoln. There's a bunch of claims out there about Kent, essentially. And there's not, or currently anyway, I have found plenty of people who want to talk about Kent in a bad regard. But if I just do that, I have nobody speaking about him in a good regard. And this documentary will be very one-sided. You see what I'm saying?
I'm personally... I wasn't present between anything, in the interaction between...
Yeah, no, of course. I'm not asking for, details. It's just more about his character, essentially. I have nobody as, a character witness for Kent. I have nobody who's wanting to defend Kent. And I'm trying pretty hard, I feel like. I'm going through, Bob Gray Sr., or is it Jr., who asked him to go to Longview, Texas.
How long has he been out now? 6.5 years?
About, yeah.
I would say he has an impeccable character. He has flaws, we all do, but...
Well, before you go on, am I allowed to repeat anything that you're saying right now?
That's what you can... Feel free to quote me on.
Okay. All right. Would you be up for, an interview? There's plenty of people who are wanting to be interviewed in the opposite direction. I got nobody on the other end, so I'm reaching out.
I know there are people who do paid interviews.
Right.
But I'm not going to say that somebody would have to pay me to do an interview. But
yeah, the people that I've got currently, I was seeing who else I could find. Of course, Cindy Lincoln is ready to have a discussion on it, to talk about it.
I bet she is.
She's done quite a few, so she's one of them. And she was mentioning a letter you wrote to her. She's mentioning, I think she just got out of court yesterday against Steve or something like that. I don't know about the letter. I don't know what that was. What she was talking about that you gave her. But I'm just trying to. But she's not obviously in Kent's favor, so I don't. It's just not helping me find the balance, essentially.
Regarding if Cindy mentioned the letter but didn't give you a copy of it, I think at the bottom of that letter, or somewhere in the contents, I let her know that I was not going to share that with anybody else unless she did. So if she chose to spread it around, then it was on her, and that is what she chose to do. So I don't know how widely it is. I don't even know if you're going to be able to get a copy of it. But it was the general gist of that was all the time that she was married to Kent, I was begging her to stop tormenting him in the evenings when he needed that quiet time at home to write the content that we all support him for. In other words, if you were a journalist working at home and you happen to have a wife who is verbally tormenting you, you wouldn't be able to get your work done.
Right.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, I mean, there's, they need to respect the boundaries and respect, what I have work to do, of course, and then I need to make sure that she needs to understand that this isn't her area, and she's ruining the part where it's my area for me to get what I need to get done.
Yeah. So if you had a wife that was doing that, and a friend of yours wrote a letter saying, "Hey, please stop that," so that your husband, meaning you, could get your work done so that you could support the family, then that would be that was the context of my letter.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, but she did say that Kent got a copy. I didn't read it, but she did tell me that Kent got a copy.
Well, I sent it out of respect to him. I sent the letter to him first, and he even asked me to tone it down a bit, and so I did, and then sent it to her.
Gotcha. Okay.
So that's the kind of man he was.
Right.
So, because there were just, I was really, really trying to stress to her the importance of making his home life peaceable. And did I give you my email?
No.
Well, I don't know how many you've got that are pro-Kent.
I don't. That's the thing. That's why I'm reaching out to anybody I can at this point. I'm like, one person, please.
There's going to be plenty of people who have something negative to say about him, and you know what? I just don't care. It just doesn't matter.
Right. So. All right. Well, yeah, much appreciated. Thank you very much. Again, I don't want to take up more of your time.
Will the email be from you and your name?
Correct.
Because I didn't get your name, I don't think.
McKinnon Mitchell.
You're McKinnon Mitchell?
Correct.
Okay. Well, see, I mean that. Boy, you're a work. You're a piece of work. That's amazing. So the answer would be no. I'm not going to be interviewed by you.
Okay. Well, and of course, is there any of this that you don't want me to repeat then? You clearly have opinions about me. I've tried to be extremely fair.
You have my statement, and that's all you get.
This is what Cindy was dealing with, and to make matters worse, Kent began recording her constantly, hoping to push her into screaming in anger. But it is verifiable that Kent was now trying to break Cindy down, as he himself admits.
And so it's not my job to, but with children, sometimes you have to break their spirit, and I have to figure out what it takes. I'm not going to do anything physical to harm her, but she needs a good spanking.
What Kent wanted was a divorce. He has often made the remark,
I didn't leave anybody. I didn't divorce anybody. She left me.
Which, strictly speaking, is true. But as we have seen, marriage isn't something Kent genuinely invests himself in. Kent doesn't see women as a person to know, love, or care about. To him, women are objects, things to be acquired simply because he believes that a man is required to have a wife. Being married is more of a status symbol to Kent, rather than a commitment made between two people who know each other deeply, who love each other, and care immensely for one another. As such, when Cindy proved that she would no longer turn a blind eye, Kent now saw her as an object to get rid of. But, given that Kent believes the Bible is against divorce, he cannot allow himself to voluntarily initiate a divorce. So how can Kent get rid of her? He made Cindy's life miserable. He tried to break her spirit. His goal was to make her leave, all while allowing him, as he has for years, to play the victim. We all have flaws, every single one of us. It's important to recognize them and work on them. But Kent's weakness is his complete and total lack of compassion towards women. How he objectifies them. He wants his wife to be blind, deaf, and mute against his flaws. yet demands that they see him as a good person, hear nothing but sweetness in his words, and tell him how amazing he is. To describe it best, Kent wants a mirror for a wife. Cindy would never be that for Kent, nor should she have been. It is not the duty of a wife to reinforce her husband's delusions. Marriage is about improving one another to be our best selves as a team, but it requires humility to know your flaws and weaknesses. Unfortunately for Cindy, she would soon learn of one of Kent's more dangerous weaknesses. Against Cindy Lincoln, Kent Hovind would demonstrate the kind of person he is for all to see. But for those who have observed Kent over the years, it would not come as a surprise to learn that Kent Hovind would physically assault his wife, Cindy Lincoln. Back in 1998, Creation Science Evangelism released one of Kent Hovind's seminars, Leviathan, the Fire-Breathing Dragon of Job 41. In this seminar, Kent Hovind would publicly admit to physically abusing his son, though of course, he would not call it that.
When one of my sons was 7 years old, we went to the dentist, and the dentist said, Mr. Hovind, this kid has a cavity. I said, yes, sir, I knew about it. Are you talking about the big one up here, or just one in his tooth? He said, well, just the one in his tooth, the only one we can fix. I said, okay, doc, let's fix it. So the dentist said, now listen, son, you're going to have to sit still, hold real still, open your mouth real wide, and I'm going to give you a shot. You're going to give me a shot? Yeah, calm down, calm down. I'm going to give you a shot. You're going to drill the bad stuff out and fill it with silver, and you'll be out of here in no time, no problem. Well, he tried to sit still. But when the dentist pulled out that 12-foot needle and poured in 10 gallons of lidocaine, he freaked out, lost control, kicking, screaming. Have you ever seen a kid do that in the dentist chair? Maybe you've done it yourself a time or two. He wanted out of there now. So the doctor called the nurse, and she came in and sat on him, and I sat on him, and the doctor sat on him, and we tried to hold him still, but man, you got to hold real still for that stuff. And finally the dentist was getting all nervous. He said, man, I can't do this. He's got to hold still. I said, Doc, let me take him outside and talk to him for a few minutes. Maybe I can calm him down. We went out to the van, sat in the back seat of the old Chevy van. I said, son, I love you very much. He said, I know, Daddy. I said, son, I told you to sit still. You did not sit still. What happens when you disobey, Daddy? He said, you get a spanking. I said, that's correct. Bend over. And boy, did I give him a spanking. It was a doozy. A few minutes later, the smoke is rising off his hind end, and the tears are coming down his cheeks, and the pearls are coming out of his nostrils. I mean, the whole thing. I said, now listen, son, we're going to go back in the dentist office, and you're going to sit in that chair. And if you wiggle one time, I'm not going to yell at you. I'm just calmly going to take you back out to the van and give you 2 spankings like you just got. And then we're going to go back in the dentist office, and if you wiggle, I'm going to bring you back out and give you 3 spankings in a row like you just got. And we're going to go back and forth all day until I get tired. And I played tennis for years, son. I have an excellent forehand smash, as you well know. I don't think I'll get tired for a while. You know, folks, we went back in the dentist's office. That kid sat in the chair, opened his mouth, grabbed the handles, and didn't move a muscle. I don't think he even breathed for 20 minutes. You know, the difference, when he was in the dentist chair the second time, he was still scared of the dentist. That had not changed. But something had changed. Now, he was more scared of me. Great psychological difference. He's more scared of me than anything in the world. That's the way I wanted it.
His child was scared, as many children are when they go to the dentist. And rather than being supportive, letting his son know that it's okay to be afraid, but also teaching his son how to conquer his fears, all Kent saw was his son disobeying him. Because as we have established, that is all that is important to Kent. Do as he says. Period. Hearing someone describe the act of spanking their child as a doozy, as smoke coming off of them, and with threats of more hits, all while his child was terrified and taking such glee at the thought of his child being afraid of him, that is child abuse. I've rarely seen Kent look as happy and proud as when he described the act of beating his child. Sadly, Kent's son was not the only individual who faced Kent's physical aggression. While the IRS conducted their investigation into his tax history, Hovind was arrested for assault, battery, and burglary in an incident with a CSC secretary on August 15, 2002. The charges were dropped in December, but it's important to note that charges being dropped does not in any way declare innocence by default. The details of the assault paint an interesting story that follows a pattern of Kent's behavior. The police report explained the following. Hovind came to the residence of his tenant at 100 Cummings Street, where he made contact with Trudy Owen at the front door and attempted to provide her with money in order for her to relocate residency. Trudy Owen said she refused to accept the money, asking Hovind to leave as she shut the front door. Hovind then forced the front door open, knocking Miss Owens backwards, and entered into the structure and began yelling loudly and acting in a hostile and aggressive manner, putting Owen in fear for her safety. Victim Christopher Kanui, also residing at the residence, attempted to intervene with this altercation, where Hovind then became physically aggressive toward Kanui, where Christopher then physically wrestled him out of the residence and onto the front porch, then slamming the front door and locking it, calling the sheriff's office to report this incident. As with anything where Kent is accused of wrongdoing, Hovind had a rebuttal to declare innocence. It seems to be a habit of Kent's to characterize himself as simply a sweet man who came to the house to help and was instead the victim of an attack. Kent claimed the following. I explained to him that at no time was I violent or threatening to anyone in the house, nor to the officer on the scene, nor would I be, as anyone who knows me will testify. The record will show that both Trudy and her son, Christopher, have a history of mental problems and violence. It is my belief that they have conspired to cause harm to me and my ministry in the hopes of getting money. It is not enough for Kent to claim innocence, but anyone who opposes Kent is then prescribed by him to have mental issues and nefarious goals against him and or Christ. This is a tactic he used against multiple people, but namely Cindy Lincoln. In Kent's mind, you would have to be mentally ill to view him in a negative light, or wrong on a subject, which is indicative of a malignant narcissist. Kent being wrong, whether factually or morally, isn't even a possibility in his mind. It has to be someone else, because if it was him, he would then have to face the fact that he has work to do on himself. As is indicative of malignant narcissists, if they can't control you, they attempt to control other people's perception of you. Kent's second wife, Mary Toko, also had a story to share in regards to Kent's violence against another child. Mary explains.
He also has a fuse that will go off, and he can be violent. I went to Alabama to testify in court against him on behalf of Cindy. I saw him violently body slam a 13-year-old boy. Several of us watched in horror as he attacked this young boy like he went insane. It was very scary.
Given that Joe was married to Kent for decades, and he openly admits to abusing his children, one may wonder if Kent had ever become physically violent with Joe Hovind. I must state for the record, in fairness to Kent, I have no valid evidence that shows Kent did abuse Joe Hovind physically without a reasonable doubt. But what I can tell you is that both I and Cindy Lincoln have spoken to Joe separately over the years. When the question of whether or not Kent was ever violent with her, she does not claim that he has, but she has also not denied it either. She instead opts to not answer and move on to another topic. Joe is not a liar. She will not say Kent physically abused her if he never did. But on the other hand, she will not say he did not abuse her if he in fact had. Take that as you will. But the most known and public event of Kent's violence happened to Cindy Lincoln, Kent's third wife.
Ow! Ow! This is my house!
Damn phone!
The audio speaks for itself, but the court finding Kent guilty says more. I sat down with Cindy Lincoln to discuss what happened and her relationship with Kent Hovind. When did you first learn of who Kent Hovind was?
2016.
You and Mary Toko, Kent's second wife, are friends, correct?
Yes, sir. I was there at her wedding, and she was my boss.
Well, when Mary left Kent, did Mary tell you as to why?
Yes. She found out that how he ran the 501c3 was not proper.
After Mary left, did you leave or stay at Dinosaur Adventure Land?
I left with Mary. I left Dinosaur Adventure Land for a time.
Kent has a litany of issues in his past that I'm sure you were aware of before agreeing to marry him yourself. What was it that drew you into him despite what you had heard?
I believed his lies. I believed his lies about Mary, about Joe, and about his innocence until I found out who the real man is behind this.
Brady Byram, Ernie Land, and Steve Lynn are close friends of Kent's. How was your relationship with them in the beginning?
In the beginning, Ernie Land pretended to be my friend. Brady Byram pretended to be my friend. Steve Lynn pretended to be my friend, just like Kent. They have a nasty underbelly that doesn't come out because it's being hidden by their nice, sweet, fake self.
During your relationship with Kent, can you pinpoint a time when you first started to notice issues with Kent or when suspicions towards him started to rise for you?
There was a drug test that Kent called. It involved Steve Lynn, and Steve Lynn was exempt from the testing. And Steve Lynn was discovered the next day to have tampered. He made it look like Kenny and Timmy were clean because they had been smoking at Steve's house. Steve had to cover his rear end. My husband said that I was lying. Kenny and Timmy were lying. That 7 other witnesses that said that Steve was a liar and that Cindy was not a liar. And Kent and Ernie Land threatened all 7 of us that if we didn't stop our nasty vendetta against Steve, that we would all be kicked off campus. And particularly, I was stated to be Cora, rebelling against Moses, God's anointed leader of Dinosaur Adventure Land.
What would you say is the tipping point from a loving husband and wife relationship to the hostile distrust that Kent extended to you?
Ultimately, the day before Steve vacated my house, he threatened me with a gun. The next day when he vacated, he did $10,000 worth of vandalism, malicious vandalism to my house. Kent refused to defend me for either of those. And not only did Kent not defend me, but he allowed what happened and promoted Steve to the board of Creation Science Evangelism. And that's when I realized that I was not in a marriage. I was in enemy territory, that I was indeed in danger. And that's when I left.
Brady Byram sent you a letter, and it's a letter that I showed in the documentary. There are events mentioned in the letter that Brady would not have known of. Do you think Kent asked Brady to write that letter to you?
How can you go beyond yes?
The relationship between you and Kent became hostile to the extent that he assaulted you. My question is, do you feel, knowing Kent as you do, that there is a history of violence in Kent's life?
Mary and I both witnessed him body slam a 13-year-old, very similarly to how he body slammed me. And since I left and I started reaching out to people because I was wondering, was Kent always like this, or did prison change him, or what the hell just happened? So Kent had told me that Joe had an injured tailbone, and he made up this story that he was rescuing her from an oncoming car, and that he accidentally pushed her to the ground in this attempt to rescue her from the car. And I started saying, I wonder if that's not really what happened. I wonder if he harmed her also. And I asked Jo about that directly, and she refused to answer.
Kent's friends seem to follow a similar pattern, that pattern being pedophilia. Is that something that you would agree with?
I know of 2 pedophiles in Kent's inner circle, one of which he just promoted to the board in February of 2022, just 2 months ago, Brady Byram.
Do you consider Dinosaur Adventure Land, as it is currently run, to be a safe place for children?
No, sir. It's not a safe place for anyone, adult, child, or animal.
Around 2 years ago, I contacted you, as well as Kent, Brady Byram, and attempted to get in touch with Ernie Land with an offer to interview each of you. The parameters of the interview were simple. I would ask questions. Each of you in your own interview would answer the questions, and I wouldn't challenge your answers. This was simply to hear the other side of the story, and I wanted this in the interest of fairness. Kent rejected the offer, of course, but in the conversations that you and I had recently, you actually explained more in depth as to what the reaction was. Could you explain what it was that actually happened?
Ernie basically told everybody that you were either a member of a cult or a private investigator or something evil, and that we were not to talk to you, that you were dangerous in some way. If we had been told you were doing a documentary, and we at the time thought that Kent was this great guy and Dinosaur Adventure Land at that time had good things going, we would have wanted to share that with you to defend Kent Hovind. But apparently Ernie and Kent were too scared that somebody might know something and have discovered their true underbelly, and that would then get publicized in your documentary.
Since coming out with these recordings and descriptions of what happened between you and Kent, you've been interviewed with atheists like myself, and it's something that Kent has commented on. Kent has a very bigoted opinion against atheists, and he seems to be disgusted that you would ever work with an atheist in any capacity. What has been your experience from interacting with atheists since this has all started?
My experience is that the atheists have treated me in a lot more godly way than the Christians.
For those who are thinking of going to Dinosaur Adventure Land, whether just visiting or living there to help Kent, what would you say to them?
I don't understand why you would have not seen enough.
Despite Kent's best efforts, the clear and obvious truth is that Kent is not a gentle person. His weakness is his hostility, not just verbally and mentally, but physically. His hostility is founded in his quest for importance and validation and his need for submission in others. He needs it so badly and needs the world to tell him he's right so much that when the world shows him the truth, that he isn't special, that he isn't intelligent, that he isn't kind, that he isn't intimidating or worth admiring, that he isn't worth listening to, his immediate reaction is to attack, whether by being verbally abusive, mentally abusive, or physically abusive. He has to try and get that person to shut up, because otherwise he is stuck with the constant reminder of the one thing he can't allow himself to accept, that he is wrong. Which brings us to our conclusion. The tone of this documentary has very much been against Kent's favor, and I make no effort to suggest otherwise. I have said plenty of harsh things about him, referencing his weakness of being unremarkable, selfish, spineless, and more. You might wonder why I would dedicate so much time and effort to someone that I regard as unremarkable. Because while Kent is the subject, This documentary isn't for him. While I have addressed Kent's victims and stand by my statement that their stories deserve to be told, this documentary isn't ultimately for them either, and it's certainly not for atheists. This isn't some evolution versus creationism or atheist versus Christian documentary that's looking to stick it to Kent. This documentary is for creationists. Disagree as they and I likely do, the reality is that it's creationists who are most at risk against Kent. It's the creationists who go to Dinosaur Adventure Land to help Kent's ministry. It's creationists who give up everything to go help what they believe to be the cause of Christ. It's creationists who are seeing Kent in a positive light before being around him day in and day out, only to find out later he is anything but positive. Provided that your beliefs are not hurting anyone, I don't care what you believe. If being a creationist is what you feel is your calling, if it's something that provides you fulfillment in your life, then I applaud you for finding a purpose. Not everyone has that. If you are a creationist and are seeking a ministry to support, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of other ministries that have the same creationist ideas as Kent, but who will not likely hurt you like Kent will. This isn't trying to get anyone to stop being a creationist or to hinder your belief in God. This is solely, entirely about helping to ensure that Kent Hovind doesn't hurt any more creationists out there. He is not a good person. Some have asked, why don't you get Kent's side of the story? The truth is, I genuinely tried. I explained to Kent every precaution that I have put in place to ensure that Kent wouldn't be challenged on his answers to my questions, and a process that would protect his words from being twisted out of context. All he would have to do is tell his side of the story and go, and I offered him this strictly in the interest of fairness, given that I am presenting the other side. Yet, time after time, with a different excuse each time, Kent has avoided this interview, despite frequently requesting the opportunity to defend himself.
And call me and give me a chance to defend myself.
Which is a perfect example of who Kent is, and one of Kent's biggest flaws. Kent Hovind is a coward. He was afraid to develop himself as a person, and instead tried to imitate. He was afraid to own up to his crimes. He was afraid to be alone and disregarded the lives of other women he entered into relationships with for his own cowardly need to have a wife for the sake of not being alone. He is afraid of people who speak out against him, though he feigns otherwise and seeks to silence those who go against him. And his cowardly behavior comes in full force the moment he realizes he cannot control someone, and lashes out against them physically, though this only seems to be against individuals he is sure he can overpower, like children and Cindy. There's no telling what series of events or environments Kent was raised in that shaped him into the person he is today, but it is plain for all to see that Kent Hovind fits the bill of a malignant narcissist. Dr. Les Carter, a psychotherapist who received his MED and PhD from North Texas State University in 1980 and works with the South Lake Psychiatric and Counseling Center, is one of the leading counselors for victims who have dealt with malignant narcissists. For those looking to make the case that Kent is a malignant narcissist, I believe the words of Dr. Carter put it best.
Narcissists must be in control. It's not that they just want to be in control. They have to be in control. They have low levels of empathy towards others. They have a really strong sense of entitlement. This is what I want. This is what I need. And you owe it to me. They are very exploitive and manipulative in the way they engage with people. They honestly believe they are superior and have to be in a superior position. They look at you from their on-high perch. They are pathologically defensive. You cannot get through to them. They do not receive input because they do not feel like they need input. Part of that is the creation of their false self. They have convinced themselves that they are so much different and more unique than anyone else, that if anyone has opinions different from their own, they simply cannot be wrong. They operate in an alternative reality. They make up their truth as they go along to suit whatever their need at the moment may be. They have an ability to create a temporary, favorable public impression. Malignant narcissists, as Erich Fromm goes so far as to say, have crossed the line into the world of evil. Beneath their narcissism is an extra layer of meanness. They do not have a well-developed conscience at all. As a result, morality to them is whatever they need it to be in the moment, if they even think about it at all. They have no willingness to appeal to authority. They are the authority. No authority has any sort of say over them. They have no accountability. They will shun any accountability against them. This means they can go to a place of ruthlessness rather easily. They are impervious to the pain they inflict on other individuals. If you feel discomfort by something they did, they first think you caused it. Secondly, they think you probably deserve it anyway. They simply do not care. When we think of narcissists, we know they tend to play the victim's role pretty easily. But when it comes to malignant narcissists, they have developed a strong paranoia. They believe that people are jealous of them, that people are wanting to bring them down. So they watch for any kind of sign that you may be against them. They seek to prevent this before it happens. Their control is an uber need for control. Narcissists often feel entitled, but malignant narcissists feel entitled at all times. They have no sense of servitude or tenderness. They just want people to cater to them. But if you ask them for simple things, they refuse, almost as if to say, "Are you kidding me? Do you know who I am?" They have a low level of guilt, sometimes to the point of zero. They ascribe an almost godlike nature to themselves and seem truly unable to see their own shortcomings. If there is a shortcoming between you and them, it will always be you. You are only ever going to be something they can use. And when they are finished with you, they will toss you off to the side like you are some sort of rotten meat, and just move on to their next victim. Knowing this, you want to keep a very low level of personal connection with these people. They do not know how to treat relationships at all. They do not understand the nature of love whatsoever. They want nothing more than to step in and tell you who you need to be and how you need to live your life. If you do not get with their program, they will try to make your life miserable or be done with you. That being the case, make no effort to reform them. Instead, at your very first opportunity, get away from them. Once you identify a person like this, the best thing you can do is realize you have much better things to do with your life and move on.
Kent is a pitiable man, not worth the time of creationists and atheists in any capacity. This documentary is to serve as a warning to both groups. To creationists, please simply find another creationist ministry to support. To atheists, let this man go. Don't debate him, because at the end of the day, you're not even debating Kent Hovind. You're ultimately debating the arguments made by Henry Morris, who was only educated in engineering, that Kent himself is simply parroting without understanding what he is saying. His audience is not comprised of tens of thousands or over 100,000 people anymore. It's a few thousand and is slowly fading away into irrelevance. Let him. As Dr. Carter explains, the only way to silence a malignant narcissist is to ignore them. I told Kent my offer to interview him to tell his side of the story would remain open until this project was completed. As of releasing this documentary, the project is now complete. Kent could make 100,000 response videos to this documentary if he wishes. Not one will ever be acknowledged or responded to. If I am suggesting that everyone should turn their backs to him forever, I should lead by example.